Good morning. I'm Father Ryan Humphries. This is the Catholic Underground CU Catechast, and our topic today is indulgences. Now, let's start by saying that the Church's mandate comes from Matthew chapter 16, verses 18 and 19. This is where we hear Jesus say, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. I will give you the keys of the kingdom. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Now, we can't overestimate how important that moment is. It's in that moment that the church goes from being a mere repeater of the teaching of Jesus, just somebody who says this is what Jesus already said, to being an authoritative interpreter of that teaching and a real judge of the worldly and the eternal. I mean, read that passage again, Matthew 16, 18, and 19. I'm using the Revised Standard Version, but you can use whatever version you tend to like. It says, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. I will give you the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind will be bound. Whatever you loose will be loosed." And so again, it's impossible to overestimate the importance of this moment and these words of Jesus. And it is impossible to reconcile the Christianity of folks who reject it. I mean, it's not as if we Catholics and Baptists are basically the same. We're talking about arguably the single most important moment about the relationship between human beings and God eternal. And when we disagree about that, we might as well disagree about the Trinity. This moment, perhaps more than any other, provides the foundation and the groundwork for what the church is. And without this moment, the Methodist is free to reject the Eucharist in John chapter 6. The Baptist is free to reject basically anything in the Christian message which doesn't fit with my personal interpretation of Scripture and my personal devotion. When Jesus establishes Peter as the genuine arbiter of the world and of the eternal, and he ratifies that after he rises from the dead and he says to Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" When that ratification happens, Peter and his successors are ultimately given what Adam and Eve were wanting. Right? Adam and Eve wanted to be the arbiters of right and wrong. They wanted to eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They wanted to decide for themselves what would be in heaven and on earth. And Jesus, shockingly, gives that exact thing to Peter. It's absolutely mind-bending. And the more you think about it, not just from a theological point of view, but from every point of view, it's utterly bewildering that God would hand over to man so much authority in eternity. You can see why the devil would have been very, very, very unhappy with God's plan and why the devil would have rebelled, because basically at this point, Peter, the Pope, good, bad, or in between, is in charge of an awful lot of the heavenly domain. And that's mind-bending. It genuinely is. Because in a very real way, Peter, or rather God, has bound himself to Peter's word. God the infinite binds himself to the word and the limited perspective of humanity, of a man. And so it is a mind-bending thing, and the importance of it just cannot be overestimated. And so with that in mind, let's turn our attention to one of the more controversial topics in church history, indulgences. So an indulgence, simply put, is the remittance of the punishment that I deserve for my sins, consciously or unconsciously. And because that sin fundamentally damages who I am, that's what sin does. Because sin fundamentally damages who I am, ultimately we can think about purgatory as a way in which God brings about the healing that is necessary to repair the damage I have done. And so an indulgence is a remittance of the punishment I deserve for my sin, And in a real way, we'll get to it a little bit more later, the whole idea of an indulgence is not just something that God writes in a book somewhere, but it's something that occurs to me naturally and supernaturally by the work of obtaining it. And so an indulgence is a remittance of punishment. And so off the bat, we have to note that there's a good deal of confusion about this topic. Part of that goes back to the Protestant Reformation and the fact that Martin Luther made a lot of noise about this, in some cases justly, in some cases not. But part of it is it's just one of those words. It's like the Crusades, where as soon as you say the word out loud, there's a lot of baggage. There's a lot of emotional baggage, a lot of ideological baggage, and very few people, even Catholics and even clergy, honestly, really spend much time cutting through all of that to get at what we're really talking about. So we have to acknowledge off the bat there's baggage. We also have to acknowledge in our own era in particular, there's extra confusion because of what Pope St. Pius X called the modernist heresy, and this movement among liberal clergy to desacralize the church. Indulgences have been kind of swirled around into a state of confusion, and most recently, the god-awful decision to replace all of the numbers associated with indulgences with plenary, which means complete or total, and partial, which is at best vague, but at worst, it completely undermines what it is we're trying to do. At worst, it's deliberately obtuse. And so we have this problem where there is an understanding of indulgences going back to about the 5th century, where it was 300 days for this, 800 days for that, 5 years for this. And now, with the stroke of a pen, that's all been kind of arbitrarily thrown out. And we just have plenary and partial. So there's a great deal of confusion associated with that. Traditionally, indulgences were associated with a length of time, which provided a kind of measure of the value of that given prayer. Now, we should say, and this is where my nerd, credibility comes in, there are a lot of measurement systems in science and elsewhere where there's a certain arbitrariness to them, but they are used mainly to provide comparison rather than absolute meaning. I mean, if we start talking about billions of dollars, none of us in our heads can get around how much $1 billion is. If we start talking about light years, which is a unit of distance and not a unit of time, trying to understand absolutely what a light year is completely nonsensical. There's no way our brains can comprehend something that big. And the same thing is true with we talk about this atom is 1,000th the size of a human hair. That's just not useful for us. But in comparison, when we say, okay, hey, Pluto is 4/10,000ths of a light year away, but the next nearest star is 4 light years away, then in our head we go, oh, that's a long, long, long way. Or we say the sun is 7 light minutes away and the next star is 4 light years. Then we start to get a sense of comparison. We still don't have any meaningful information about what a light year is. But so the absolute measurement is not as important as the comparison measurement. In the same vein, we could think about that with indulgences. For example, the sign of the cross. If I make the sign of the cross with holy water, 300 days indulgence. But if I make the sign of the cross without the holy water, 100 days of indulgence. So it's 3 times better to use holy water than not. And of course, there's a certain facetiousness to this. There's a certain kind of, tongue-in-cheekness to it, because you can't talk about an absolute triple the value. How do we even begin to understand that? But we can say it is significantly better to use holy water than not use holy water. And that's ultimately what all these numbers are trying to communicate. It's just a reality that, we understand that using holy water is better, and we want to communicate that in some way that we can quantify, but we don't want to do it in a way that's completely, obtuse. Contrarily, if we say that going to make a pilgrimage to Rome, making a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, praying my rosary 15 decades a day, and making the sign of the cross are all partial indulgences, we have no meaningful way to contrast or compare those things. Is it the same to read the Bible in a church for 15 minutes as it is to pray 15 decades of the rosary? Well, if we're both talking about partial indulgences, then it is. But then again, making the sign of the cross is a partial indulgence too, and so is making a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. So how do we even make the comparison? And that's why the days measure is so much valuable. And again, I want to reiterate one more time, like light years, it's difficult, if not impossible, to get at an absolute meaning of these numbers. So when I say the numbers, and I think the numbers are valuable, I don't want to give us an idea that we can somehow or another introduce these things into an economy and start saying, oh, I'm going to earn 600 indulgences today, or I'm going to do all these different things today, because that's something I'll talk about later. That's a danger in and of itself. So let's step back to basics and come back to the first thing we talked about. The Pope has the authority to bind and to loose. He has the authority to forgive sins, and he has the authority to extend the faculty to others to forgive sins. And so, for example, after the priest is ordained, right? I was ordained about 15 years ago. I laid on the ground. I got up. The bishop put his hands on my head, ordained, just like that. Super good. Now, until I got my packet of paper that was called my faculties, until that happened, I wasn't allowed to absolve sins, because that authority to absolve sins does not begin with me. It does not come from my ordination. It extends from Peter through his successors, through the bishops that he approves for consecration, and then to me. And so authority is not something that I have on my own. It's something that I get ultimately from St. Peter, and that is given to me in a basically a formal statement of what I am deputed to do. And so when we think about indulgence, we have to remember that this is part of the everyday life of the church. And so Peter has the ability and the choice and the freedom to extend these faculties as he would like. And he can do that to people, but he can also do that with spiritual exercises and with prayers. And so Peter then establishes the structure of the sacrament of confession, for example. Confession didn't begin in the year 400. There was nobody who could, Constantine could not knock on a door and say, can I go to confession with the priest? That didn't exist. It didn't come around until almost 800 years after Christ, when the Irish monks and the Scottish monks started to develop a system of individual one-to-one confession. And even then, we're still talking about several hundred years before it becomes the norm in the church. That's not a function of random coincidence. That's the function of Peter choosing to do things the way that he wants it to be done. In the same way, for a long time, the formula for confession had to be said in Latin. Nowadays, Peter says, no. Starting in the 1940s, Peter said you can say the formula in English under certain circumstances or in the vernacular. And now even further, one of the things that the Second Vatican Council Fathers actually did discuss about the vernacular was confession. Because for most folks coming to confession, they don't have a syllable of Latin, and hearing those words, I absolve you, is a helpful thing. And so there are genuine places where Peter exercises his authority and says, look, I decide what the confessional looks like. I decide that because I'm the successor of Peter, and all the rest of us kind of do what he says to do. And the same thing happens with spiritual exercises like indulgences. Now, at the top of the list of this kind of spiritual exercises that over the course of the last 2,000 years have been tested, approved, disapproved, indulgence, at the top of that list, we have the devotions and spiritual exercises which are given divinely by Jesus, by God the Father, in the Bible. And so we look at something like fasting. Fasting is something that we see in the Old Testament and in the New. It's a spiritual exercise that God attaches a great deal of authority to and a great deal of value. And so fasting is indulgence, But if we remember at the very beginning when I was defining indulgence, we want to think about that not in terms of there's a list of stuff I did wrong, red in my ledger, so to speak, and I'm just trying to get as much black on the other side so that I end up not too upside down, so I don't spend too long in purgatory. We want to think about this as more of the damage my sin has done and the healing that needs to follow from it. And so fasting, the Lord tells us, is an essential part of the work of healing my own self and the community for the sins I've committed and the damage those sins have done. Also, the works of charity, assisting the poor. This is not something that the Pope decides. This is something that arises directly from the Old Testament and the New Testament. God tells us that this is an indulgent spiritual exercise. It has genuine, valuable effect. And in fact, Peter has simply ratified that by saying doing this gets you so much indulgence as opposed to doing that which gets you so much indulgence. We could extend preaching the gospel, which I'm happy about as a priest, gets you some indulgences. That's also a biblical idea. We also have early in the church new indulgences that arose. For example, before there were church buildings, you could gain indulgences by hosting Mass at your house or by converting part of your house into a chapel. You could gain indulgences by being, before deacons became a thing, the one to distribute Holy Communion. As time passed, the rosary, pilgrimages, venerating relics, which we'll talk about another day, reading the Bible, lighting votive candles, cooking a roast for the convent. I mean, any number of different things became things that were indulgence, partially because the Pope said these are indulgence, but even more so because through experience and through practice, saints and holy people began to realize these things were good and important for the soul. And so then they went to the Pope and said, hey, this thing works. And the Pope then ultimately stamps it and says, it sure does work. It's got my seal of approval. And it works very much the same way with canonizations, although that's somewhat down a different tangent. It's not the job of the Pope to make saints. It's the job of the Pope to declare that this one or that one is a saint. And with indulgences, it works kind of a similar way, although it used to be very, very clear that the Pope would say 800 days for this or 200 days for that. Now everything is partial, but I won't get off on that particular soapbox at this moment. So that being said, we have, this idea of certain prayers and certain spiritual exercises that have arisen over time, which have innate spiritual value, and which the Pope declares by his role as Peter, the one who looses and binds, because he's the one with the keys. The Pope declares this or that or the other is indulgence. Now, you'll notice I'm not counting the sacraments here at all, because the sacraments don't flow from the Pope's authority. They flow directly from Jesus Christ. A sacrament is the manifest presence of Jesus Christ in the world. And so we don't have, it's not as if the Pope says, a baptism is an indulgence thing. By its nature, the one being baptized receives a plenary indulgence. That's just the nature of its action. But that is not because somebody, put a book together and said, this is where the indulgence lives. Incidentally, the book, if I happen to mention accidentally, is called the Enchiridion, which nobody needs to know. It's named after a book of Stoic philosophy from the 2nd century. So if you Google Enchiridion, you're going to be confused anyway. Don't fret. You don't need it. It's not helpful. There are plenty of websites with good prayers. If you just look up indulgence prayers, they're there. You don't need the Enchiridion. It's a bit, convoluted. So that being said, we have these prayers and spiritual exercises. Over the course of years, popes have declared by their authority that this or that or the other spiritual exercise has this or that relative value. Maybe it's 300 days, maybe it's 50 years. The numbers correlate to time in purgatory that will be taken off my sentence. But like I said before, we just don't have any comprehension of the absolute meaning of those numbers. And time is complicated philosophically. When we start talking about time in the context of eternity, it's way, way more complicated. And so the theological understanding of purgatory is not something that's helpful to think about like a prison sentence. It's much, much better to think about it like a healing process where, say I die and I love the Lord, generally speaking. I have a fundamental disposition for the Lord, but I've got some sins. I've repented of those sins, but the damage is done. And so now there's healing that needs to happen. The wound itself has been cured, but there's healing that needs to take place. And purgatory is that. And anybody knows if you have a nasty wound, there can be a lot of pain healing that wound. There can be a great deal of suffering healing that wound, and that's what we need to think about purgatory like, as opposed to thinking about it as a prison sentence where I owe 1,000,000 years and I'm just trying to chisel away at that debt that I owe. We also have to resist the temptation to think about, think economically, like a bank account about these things. Purgatory is not owed, like I said, 1,000 days for mild gossip, 10,000 for malicious gossip, 100 years for sexual sin, or 10,000 years for punching a nun. That's not the way it works. It probably should work that way, but it's not the way it works. It's not the way the Lord set it up. And so we don't want to get in the habit, and this was something that happened in various cultures, of mechanizing our spiritual life to maximize the efficiency or the earning potential by only saying the best prayers. God bless her. There was a lady in my former parish who she came with a gallon Ziploc bag of little booklets. And every day she came to daily mass, and then she would sit in the church for 2 or 3 hours just blasting through, all these indulgence prayers. And she must have gone through 1,000 prayers every day, and that's, it may or may not have been helpful for her. I think she probably had some OCD, but still, that's not what the Lord is asking for in terms of prayer. It's not what the Lord is asking for in terms of indulgence prayer, for sure. We're not trying to maximize our potential by only saying the good prayers. What we're trying to do is to look to these kind of indulgences as a way of framing what the Lord wants us to understand about what is good and what is not necessarily good in the spiritual life, or what may be good and what may be better. Indulgence prayers and spiritual exercises have been judged by Peter to have value in this world and in the next. And by offering these prayers, by offering these spiritual exercises with a heart free from attachment to sin, we will grow in the knowledge and love of God and will gain grace. Now, grace, you remember, is the life of God. It's what animates us. It's what makes us alive. It's damaged by sin. It's amplified by holiness of life. Grace is the treasure in heaven which strengthens me here and now. And that's why there are 5 so-called requirements for receiving an indulgence, big or small. The most important one is to be entirely free from attachment to sin. Lord Jesus, I want to please you entirely. I detest my sin because I fear the loss of heaven and the pains of hell. It's detachment from sin. I don't want to ever sin. I want to be sin-free. Now you can see, while having that disposition is already putting you in a good spot, right? So when we think about indulgences, the conditions surrounding them are already conducive to growing in holiness. So it's not as if the Pope tells me to jump left-footed on a trampoline while drinking orange juice, I'll get a plenary indulgence, that I can go murder somebody and then go hop on the trampoline and I'm good to go. That mentality, which was never broadly held by the church, that mentality is wildly inconsistent with holiness. But just the nature of these five requirements. One being entirely free from attachment to sin. The second being sacramental confession, a worthy communion, and prayer for the Pope, 2, 3, and 4. All 3 of those, fundamentally by their nature, dispose us to holiness. They dispose us to the healing action of the Holy Spirit. They all feel quite logical. And finally, then we have the indulgence prayer or exercise. So if I want those 300 days for making the sign of the cross and wash and with the holy water, I need to have this absolute disposition. If I want to receive that indulgence, I need to go to confession and receive Holy Communion. I need to pray for the Holy Father, and I need to do that with a sense of devotion. And so you can see whether or not I put the word indulgence with that or not. Just the fact of having that disposition and doing those things is going to be healing of the damage I've done to my own soul with sin and it's going to be healing for the community because it's going to help sanctify the community. And ultimately, that's where indulgences really flow from. Put together, those 5 things form a single spiritual action. Just like when we talk about the Holy Triduum, we talk about 3 days but 1 liturgical act. When we talk about the 5 requirements for indulgences, we're talking about a unified, integral spiritual act. And that's why we talk about the confession needing to be associated with. People always ask, well, Father, to get the indulgence, can I go to confession a week later, a month later? And the answer really should be no. 1, you should go to confession before because you need to receive communion worthily. But the reality is that these acts need to be integral. And so, yeah, you might be able to make that work if you've got that right disposition and it's a week one way or the other. But in reality, if we want to receive an indulgence, we need an integral act. And so because time, is not as important for Christians, you can do that with a couple days here or there. But the question is, can I, with my soul, make that one action? The communion, the confession, the act itself, the free disposition of soul, and the prayer for the Holy Father. If that's one unified act, then yes, you can do it at really whatever distance you feel like you can pull off. But we don't want to get into an idea of loopholism. We don't want to get into an idea of legalism. And so as that's put in place, as we come to understand those 5 things, then we start to see why indulgences work the way they work, because the Pope is basically saying, look, if you've got the right disposition, this prayer is good for you. If you have the right disposition, the rosary will sanctify you. It will bring healing to your soul. If you have the right disposition, saying a simple prayer like, my Jesus, have mercy, will sanctify you. If you've got the wrong disposition, it's like the sower and the seed. Nothing is going to help. If the seeds fall on the sandy soil or they fall among thorns, it doesn't matter how good the seed is. On the other hand, if the seed is good and the soil is good, then it's largely moot what part of that is really going to matter one way or the other. And so when it comes to indulgences, we're going to ultimately be limited by our own holiness. And when I ask the Lord for a plenary indulgence, that is the remission of all my sins, that's ultimately going to be limited by my own holiness. If I am properly disposed, then the Lord can bring about perfect healing and make me a saint. But if I'm not properly disposed, the Lord's going to do what the Lord can do. He can only work with the soil he's got. And that's part of the reason that indulgences turned into such a debacle, because that part of the teaching was left out by a few, unscrupulous Dominicans. Not that all Dominicans are unscrupulous. I love me some Dominicans, but, they cause a big part of the problem. So at any rate, an indulgence is a kind of speed healing for my soul. It's gained through a spiritual action and an associated disposition of soul. You can see why selling of indulgences was ridiculous on the face of it, I hope, and it wouldn't have had any spiritual value for the purchasers anyway, but that's an historical thing that's off for another talk. Indulgences do genuinely require a lot from us. They require confession, worthy Holy Communion, freedom from attachment to sin. They require prayer for the Holy Father and the indulgence exercise itself. It should be offered to the Lord as a single integral act, and it should be offered with the understanding that I'm not purchasing holiness in some kind of economy, but I'm seeking healing for the damage that my own sin has done, conscious or unconscious sin, and I'm seeking healing for the community by doing it. And so, that's it. That's the story. Now, if you're looking for indulgences or indulgence prayers, again, don't go searching out the Enchiridion. It's complicated. It's hard to read. It's theological. Just Google. There's a bunch of traditional Catholic websites, and if you search for traditional Catholic prayers indulgences, you'll find a ton of them. You'll find all sorts of things. I've got another talk coming up about devotions which have specific promises. So, like in the case of the Rosary, the Pope has signed that says this is an indulgence, but Our Lady has come and done him one better and said, but I've got other promises for that. We're not talking about those things. This is specifically indulgences. So if you search for traditional Catholic prayers indulgence, you'll find tons of them. And you'll find their traditional numberings in terms of days and years, which can be helpful, again, for comparison, but it's important not to think that I can understand in an absolute way what that means. There's not a saint that's ever lived that can explain what it means to get 300 days off purgatory. Not anybody. So don't feel bad if that seems boggling to you, but every one of us can say, well, if this one gets me 300 days off and that one gets me 3,000 days off, that's probably a prayer that's going to be more beneficial for me in the long run, but it doesn't mean that I should try to use that to purchase or maximize my purchasing ability or whatever that case may be. So again, indulgences can be confusing. They can be challenging. There's a lot of emotional baggage with them, but at the same time, they're a very helpful part of our faith. They flow from an essential aspect of the belief that we have in the role that Peter plays. And so there's something that we can't just set aside or say, I'm going to be Catholic without them. They're something that's essential to our understanding of purgatory, salvation, the nature of the church, the nature of human nature, all of those things. And so I hope this is in some way helpful to you. It is not meant to be a primer or the 101 course on indulgences. This is meant to be kind of a fill in the gaps around the edges of folks who already have some understanding of what we're talking about. And so if you do need a 101 or a primer, please do look out. There's plenty of courses on YouTube and articles out there on it. But I hope it's helpful. I hope it's been wonderful. Thank you for joining us on the Catholic Underground. I've been Father Ryan Humphries, and we will see you later on.